Hello anarchists and antichrists, it's your boy Slayer here. Back in January of this year, I made a two-part series going over the various genres of metal and how newcomers can get into them. It was something I was inspired to do after seeing a fellow YouTuber by the name of Purg Productions doing a similar thing, albeit much more talented than mine, and with a whopping 8 parts. With metal being my favorite style of music, those videos were something bound to happen someday. Well, it's time for a spin-off to those videos, on my second favorite style of music, punk rock. What is punk exactly? To some, it means Green Day and Blink-182. To others, it's Sex Pistols and the Ramones. And according to pretentious music journalists, it means overhyped pop rappers because they pissed off some evangelicals. To me, the essence of punk is doing what you want to do, being yourself regardless of what other people think. Non-conformity, in other words. And that's something I'd like to see more of in a time where it seems barely anyone is able to think for themselves anymore. Punk rock as a genre can actually trace some of its roots back to 50s rock and roll in some ways. Loud but simple 3-chord songs that shocked many a concerned parent due to how rambunctious they were for their time. Yeah, believe it or not, but stuff such as Chuck Berry and Elvis were considered heavy for their time. Oh, the moral guardians of the 50s. People who thought Elvis was dangerous but thought that smoking an entire pack of cigarettes was healthy.
And because they know what a pleasure it is to smoke a mild, good-tasting cigarette, they're particular about the brand they choose. In a repeated national survey, doctors in all branches of medicine, doctors in all parts of the country were asked, "What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?"
But this would carry on into the 60s, with the Beatles revitalizing rock and various surf rock and garage rock groups as well. 60s garage rock is considered by many to essentially be the beginning of punk rock in a sort of way. A lot of this 3-chord loud rock from the mid-60s to early 70s is often considered proto-punk, and the same way stuff such as Cream and Jimi Hendrix are often considered proto-metal. The most famous example would probably be the Stooges, who were highly influential to the development of punk rock despite never being a massive hit. Just remember, kids, just because something is way underground doesn't mean it can't be a massive influence. An earlier example would be the Sonics, who were one of the loudest rock bands on the planet circa the mid-60s. By extension, many other garage rock bands of the period can also be considered proto-punk as well. This label doesn't just apply to 60s garage rock, even glam rockers had an influence, with the 1971 song Hang On To Yourself by David Bowie being only a few steps removed from the proper punk of the mid to late 70s. But alas, this is just a stepping stone towards the birth of true punk rock. Punk rock is a blanket term in the same vein as heavy metal. Metal can mean anything from Iron Maiden to Deicide to fucking baby metal, in the same way that punk rock can mean anything from the Dead Kennedys to Good Charlotte. When I simply say punk rock, I mean the first few waves of punk rock back when the genre was truly born. Let's be real here, even if you don't consider the Ramones to be the first punk rock band, they were definitely the band who gave birth to the true punk rock scene. These 4 leather-bedecked New Yorkers were true rock and roll heroes at the time. The mid to late 70s was not a very good time for rock, believe it or not, as the charts were being bloated by sissy soft rock crap, pandering attempts at disco fever, and pure boomer energy. What rock needed was a true return to form, and the Ramones succeeded at that with a raw, 3-chord and lo-fi approach played at breakneck speed for the time. Their debut album is highly influential to say the least, even outside of the realm of punk. Overseas in the UK, we had the Sex Pistols, who were just straight up trolls. Their whole image was just to piss people off and cause controversy, which has had the unfortunate effect of causing internet douchebags to associate any act that offends people as being the new punk rock. It applies to both nutjobs like Paul Joseph Watson and pretentious music critics praising any pop artist who sparks controversy amongst evangelicals. Both of these camps being corporate shills in their own right. In spite of that and the fact they only made one album, I still enjoy the Sex Pistols. But by far my favorite punk band is the Dead Kennedys. By far one of the most diverse punk bands in terms of sound. This band is fucking legendary, with their biting, satirical lyrics that are still relevant even now. To this day, DK are in my top 5 favorite bands ever of any genre, and I can't recommend them enough. Hardcore punk is basically punk rock, but 11 times more angry and aggressive. It's a fairly intense style of music, to the point where a lot of uninitiated individuals confuse it for being metal. Now, there is no denying it was an influence towards stuff such as thrash metal, but on its own terms, hardcore punk is not metal. But if you are looking for a style of music that is simultaneously punk and metal, crossover thrash exists, along with the band Motorhead. Black Flag is a notable example, with a debut album where half of the songs don't even surpass the 2-minute mark. This is kind of a staple of the subgenre. Songs that are so short, plug your ears and you'll miss them. Hardcore punk also delved further into social issues than beforehand. The previously mentioned Dead Kennedys also quickly moved into the realm of hardcore, and tackled everything from police brutality to the music industry and even a middle finger to Nazis. Suicidal Tendencies were one of the first hardcore bands to blend metal elements into their sound. Metal and punk were previously opposing forces despite both being loud, rebellious rock, but Suicidal Tendencies helped pave the way for a punk-metal brotherhood. And let me tell ya, as someone who enjoys both punk and metal almost equally, I applaud them for doing that. Post-punk steers punk in the opposite direction of hardcore, and came up around the same time. Occasionally it would blend with new wave, a style of music that deserves mention here despite not really being punk. Punk was an initial influence on new wave before the beep-boop synths and overproduction drowned out any last remaining elements of punk. Joy Division are true masters of post-punk, with moody emotional tracks such as Disorder, one of my favorite songs of all time. It's just a track that I'll turn on and cry to whenever I'm feeling particularly angsty. In general, post-punk eschews most of the grit and distortion of pure punk in favor of a more jangly and clean sound. The Clash, members of the initial wave of punk, also delved into this style, with their 1979 album London Calling frequently featured in best albums of all time lists. A lot of post-punk acts had a heavy influence on what would later become alternative rock. And a lot of modern indie rock take notes from the modeled tone of post-punk. So post-punk really is a scene that never truly died. Now the controversial part. A subgenre of punk that old school fans often see as a betrayal to the guidebook of punk. Pop punk. Even though many people would like to point their fingers at Green Day for kickstarting the bevy of pop-influenced punk bands, pop punk can trace its roots back to the Ramones. You know, a band that every punk fan is required by law to worship at least once a week. Their first few albums are littered with catchy punk songs. Try listening to Sheena is a Punk Rocker and tell me that isn't a precursor to pop punk. But yes, Green Day was the band that kicked off what we now universally recognize as pop punk. And in spite of where I may have been headed, I do quite like some of their stuff. Dookie is a fairly great record, and having grown up in the early to mid 2000s, I absolutely love American Idiot. That album just gives me the nostalgic tingles whenever I hear it. On the harder side of pop punk, we have The Offspring, who are my favorite pop punk band. You're Gonna Go Far Kid is one of my favorite punk rock songs, full stop. I just love the hell out of it. And in general, The Offspring have that edgy but melodic sound I'm looking for without being too poppy. On the poppier side, we have Blink-182 and Simple Plan, bands that some would argue aren't even punk in the first place, but I still think they count. Similar to how nu metal gets derided as false metal even though, it's metal whether you like it or not. You can't tell me Slipknot, Korn, and System of a Down aren't metal. I do have some qualms about the poppier side of pop punk, but I have warmed up to it as I've grown older. A lot of that is because of the depressing fact we really don't get any rock in the mainstream anymore. And that's a can of worms I won't go into because I actually got bullied for liking rock back in the early 2010s, and to this day I suffer mild PTSD from the mockery I faced in. Pop-punk is a great entryway to rock music as a whole. In fact, All the Small Things by Blink-182 was the first rock song I ever heard, all the way back around 2001 or so when I was still barely a toddler. So, like it or not, but pop-punk is a very important style of music that deserves most of the success that it has received. Some other smaller subgenres of punk would include garage punk, which can either refer to the previously mentioned garage bands of the 60s, but more often than not, it refers to more lo-fi indie rock acts such as the White Stripes. Skate punk is a genre that more or less refers to punk bands popular amongst skater kids, NoFX being the most famous example. Horror punk includes bands such as the Misfits, and as it sounds, is horror-themed punk. And we also have surf punk, a mixture of surf rock and punk. Agent Orange is a good band if you want to get into that subgenre. There are a couple of other subgenres, but in general, punk really isn't as diverse as metal, a genre with about 150 different subgenres and offshoots. I mean, there's only so much you can do with 3 chords. But if you like simple but effective music, punk rock is right up your alley. And the more down-to-earth and street-level lyrics will have a lot of emotional appeal. That's the thing punk has that completely outclasses metal. Punk never delves into nerdy fantasy-themed wank, and keeps it real and to the point. But regardless, I have an equal amount of love for both metal and punk, and do plan on continuing my beginner's guide to metal with a few more subgenres and leftovers that I forgot to mention. But in the meantime, I've gotta go skate it up and destroy the establishment like a true nonconformist. The Tony Hawk's franchise of video games was arguably the entryway to punk rock for a lot of kids in the 2000s, myself included. As soon as I booted up THPS1 and heard the Dead Kennedys police truck, there was no going back. Much like how the V-Rock station in GTA Vice City sparked my love for metal, the soundtracks to the Tony Hawk games made me a punk rocker in the same vein. And for that, I will always consider the Tony Hawk's franchise one of my favorite gaming series of all time. That and they're just damn fun games. Okay, not all of them were forged in God's fireplace, but the series was absolutely state-of-the-art up until American Wasteland. Hopefully I'll review a couple of those games in the near future. Punk and metal share a certain fashion sense. Leather. Something I've clearly adopted into my own image. I even own one in real life. Although my current residence among the Gulf Coast means I only really get to wear it about 3 months out of the year, oh well, it's still worth the $100 I spent on it. Leather jackets are just sexy, can you really blame me?